Hi, Damai, welcome. You're listening to People, Planet, Food, conversations about the global food system that I hope are a cause for optimism and a call to action. I'm Roger Robson-Williams, Chief Sustainability Officer here at Plant and Food Research. I'm interested in how to grow healthy, enjoyable, affordable food in ways that don't harm people or planet. In this podcast series, I'm talking to some of the interesting people I've met about what needs to change if we're to have healthy people living on a healthy planet and eating healthy food. In this episode of People, Planet, Food, I'm delighted to be talking with Brendan O'Connell, a friend and a leader in the application of agritechnology to the global food system, to help make it healthier, fairer and a force for environmental good. Brendan studied engineering in Ireland and moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand 25 years ago. He's nearly 20 years' experience in the primary sector and been described as an evangelist for agritechnology in New Zealand. As well as running AgritechNZ, which we'll hear a bit more about in a moment, Brendan has his own consultancy helping businesses get their products to market. He retains strong links with his country of birth through his work with Enterprise Ireland, helping the development of Irish businesses here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Welcome, Brendan.
It's not great, Roger. Great to be here.
Before we get started, it would be great to hear a bit about how you have landed up being CEO of AgritechNZ.
The life story piece. I guess my interest in technology in general started with studying mechanical engineering, and straight away for me, from a career point of view, that ended up working in product development. So I always liked the creation of new products and the whole sort of match of sort of engineering and science skills with creativity in terms of that sort of creative process. And then across the years, I got involved in lots of different industries. I started out in the biomedical space, ended up doing some work in telecommunications and light industry. When I came to New Zealand, it was my first introduction to agritech. And so I started working with a company called TrueTest back in 2006, and they do livestock solutions and the like. And I found an affinity with agritech that I hadn't found since I was in the biomedical space when I first left university. And so, finding an industry where you could see a very clear connection between the role of technology and genuinely positive human outcomes. I'd done some really interesting work over the years prior to that with, in sort of consumer electronics and probably, really cool technology. I worked with a company called Navman here in New Zealand, and we were doing excellent pieces of technology, solid state radar and instrumentation systems and really leading edge stuff. And yet I sort of knew it was going to be used on some rich guy's boat for about 40 hours a year up in the States. And so there wasn't really a connection with the application of the technology or the outcomes it was generating. In biomedical and in agritech, I guess I found a real purpose. And so just love that connection with knowing how the technology is being used. So TrueTest was sort of entry to the agritech space. And then through that, I was involved in solutions in the livestock space with TrueTest, but also got involved with a lot of other industry players over time. And so probably where you and I met, Roger, back in the day was where we looked at the connection between what was happening with commercial companies, universities, research groups, and we a group of us established the Precision Agriculture Association back in 2013, I think it was, or something like that.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and so that again was looking at sort of the shared connections around agritech with research, with education, with farmer groups and applications and the like. And so Precision Agriculture Association of New Zealand was a forum for bringing some of that together. And then later on, the Precision Agriculture Association merged with Agritech New Zealand. And so it sort of felt like a natural progression. And eventually I ended up, when sort of agritech was growing, ended up taking this role as Chief Executive with Agritech New Zealand.
Tell me, what does AgritechNZ do?
So AgritechNZ is an independent industry association, which means that we are funded by our members, and those members are organisations that see and appreciate the connection between all their interests in this space of innovation in the agricultural space. So our members include organisations which are obviously the agritech businesses. They might be the established businesses like Gallagher and LIC and and groups like that. There could be a whole pile of new agritech innovators who might not be as well known. The Way Beyonds, the Hectors, the Protags, the Bovonics, the Cropexes, a whole pile of new brands and solutions that are coming out there. But in addition to those direct agritech businesses, it's the science system that fuels agritech, which is so our universities and our Crown Research Institutes. Obviously, Plant and Food has been a member for many years alongside Ag Research and many other universities and CRIs here in New Zealand. It includes the investors who are sort of, again, fueling those sort of connections between how to get science applied through early stage businesses or existing businesses and out there. And then many of the enablers around the agritech ecosystem. So it's a community of people who are seeing connections between all of these different capabilities in growing agritech as a sector. And so our role as an industry association is, first of all, sort of create an opportunity to connect and a sense of community around those things, to promote what happens in agritech, both the opportunities and the challenges, as we'll explore in this conversation, and then to look at advancing agritech as a sector. And from New Zealand's perspective, I look at it as being, creating new options for New Zealand. What we achieve in terms of our primary industries is fantastic for New Zealand. It's definitive of how the world looks to us. It's fundamental in terms of how we create wealth for New Zealand and afford all of the things that we want in New Zealand. Agritech is something that's decoupled from the actual, even though it's strongly related to the growing practices here in New Zealand, it can be applied internationally, and therefore it creates new opportunities for New Zealand to benefit from and have an impact in what happens in the world. And I guess that's the conversation we'll have around how do we help guide that. And our role as an industry association is to create that sense of community, be here when people try and come to look for solutions in agritech or understand what the role of agritech is. And so we're here to advance the agritech sector.
And are there parts of the community that need to be involved in advancing agritech in the food system that you feel are perhaps underrepresented in AgritechNZ at the moment?
Ourselves and the Executive Council are probably, we're quite proud of the ecosystem representation that we've got. So I'm not seeing missing groups in terms of types of organisations. And yet there's no doubt, like in lots of these sort of member discretionary pieces, some people carry the load more than others. So I think there are agri-businesses out there are agri-tech businesses out there where they're leaving it to others in the community to carry the load rather than coming and joining in themselves. So I don't think we're missing anything in terms of types, but I do think there's people that we would say there is benefit from identifying yourself formally as part of this community and leaning into some of the collective work, because there is a lot of collective work that needs to happen, not least because of the things that we'll discuss in this session in terms of, how does agritech get applied and how do we relate that to here locally and globally as well. So I think there's a lot of shared work to do.
So implicit in that is an open invitation for individuals and organisations to get in touch with you if they think they've got a contribution to make.
Absolutely. We can achieve a lot more together.
Thanks. Yeah, so we've talked about agritech, and this podcast series is about people, planet and food. So can you just explain what you mean by agritech and how it can help the food system?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I see technology in general as being the practical application of new science knowledge. And so agritech is exactly that. It's applying new knowledge and new systems through to agricultural practice and food growing practice. So that can include a range of technology types, the physical, mechanical stuff in terms of automation and robotics. It can include digital stuff in terms of sensors and software and new solutions in that space. And it can include a lot of biological applications as well. So it's new capabilities. And it covers, everything that you might mean by agriculture. So it gets applied in horticulture, in dairy, in dry stock, in arable solutions, in viticulture. And so it's got, a wide range of applications. Ultimately, as tools and platforms to enable new types of behavior within those growing systems. So it's an enabler of new practices. It includes tools that can, make apparent things that might not be apparent without those tools. It can enable new levels of interaction. And so ultimately it's an enabler of change. And therefore that can be applied for good, where we hope and most success is going to be driven, and that good can be for both people, place and planet. So that's the whole range of where it can be applied.
Yeah, when we met up for breakfast this morning, we were talking a bit about this, and I was really interested in your view around agritech being an enabler of, changes in people's behaviour. And I just wondered if you could unpack a bit more some practical examples here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that you've seen that happening.
Well, I guess the old adage that's used by many companies in this is, you can't manage what you don't measure. So that's a sort of a business principle that's been used. And so, by being able to measure things in a new way, you can definitely decide to behave differently. And so, in New Zealand, we've seen things like animal traceability be implemented initially and very importantly for biosecurity purposes. But all of a sudden, now that you have an animal identity, you can start attaching other meaning or other measures to that. So you can start having more explicit measurements of growth rates, of health conditions, of movements, that you can start exposing new levels of behavior. Ultimately, that example ends up in, sort of greater levels of productivity per animal. And we've seen significant steps in that space. So I guess the technology has enabled new ways of animal management and hopefully a reduction over time in, growth by adding new animals or by increasing populations, rather than sort of growth and insight to impacts by better control over single units and better control over individual animals. So that's one example, I guess, of where technology can make a difference in agriculture.
Yeah, thanks. And that seems like a really important example of, being able to deliver multiple benefits in terms of productivity, animal welfare, helping people to do their jobs better. Have you got an example top of mind of agritech delivering a really tangible kind of environmental benefit of some sort?
Yeah, I think there are plenty of examples of where, in addition to that sort of overall capability improvement, there's specific ways of directly improving the environment. I think of real challenges around freshwater quality and challenges in terms of nutrient application, and how good knowledge of soil types, soil compositions, matched with current weather and soil conditions in terms of their moisture capacity, and using that type of insight to control the application of, in a dairy scene, could be the place and timing of control of effluent, or the place and timing of control of fertilizer or other things, so that you're directly reducing nutrient runoffs and damage to waterways. I think technology enables a greater level of control and insight around that. And so that would be one example of a direct benefit.
And I guess that's integrating, sensing technology with the capacity to process that data and turn it into useful information that people can then use to inform, for example, kind of variable rate application of water or fertilizer. So it's kind of bringing a bunch of those things that you were talking about earlier together.
I think that's the nature of technology. Again, they're capabilities that build on top of each other. So you're right, that sort of, first of all, having a way of communicating soil composition or soil types, and then ways of matching that mapped geospatial information with weather information, with local sensors. That's all sort of in the, I guess, a mixture of sensor and then communicating that in digital ways. But then you match that to mechanical systems of pump control and, as you say, sort of variable rate applications where you can do micro control over flow meters across a wide area at a really refined level. You're talking about unlocking capabilities across sort of physical, digital, and then of course you've got the biological, again, that sort of hits on that, sort of what are you actually applying, and so can you also apply that with greater resolution and greater control. So it's a combination, and I guess it's the nature of technology and capabilities that they build on each other. One step improvement can enable something else.
And I think that's really interesting that you kind of paint this picture of agritech as being this kind of nexus of kind of human capability and technology and data processing and automation and so on, which kind of makes a lot of sense to me. I guess coming into this conversation, to be honest, I was kind of thinking about, harvesting robots and, that kind of level of automation. Have you got any comments on that side of the coin, as it were?
Well, I mean, I often think when we talk about technology, we end up spending too much time talking about the technology rather than sort of the context. And so I definitely see, and it's definitely been a motivator for me. And when I sort of speak with the various agritech innovators out of there, they have a very human dynamic around what they're trying to achieve. And there's a very strong link between what humans are trying to do and how they use the tools to enable to do it. Having said that, you can definitely look at some very cool pieces of technology that might take humans out of the mix in certain tasks. I think some really interesting examples in that, I've been on site in different parts of the world looking at voluntary milking systems. You don't have humans directly involved in the daily milking side of things. And so it's done by machines, it's done by, robots effectively that, cows can walk up to. They'll get rewarded with some sort of treat in doing it, but they also get to be milked, which is when you need to be milked. And to see humans taken out of that environment is very interesting. In that particular example, it feels like a calmer, animal-centric approach than the practice of necessarily pushing a large number of animals through a dairy shed all at the same time to a human time frame, rather than at a time frame that suits them to walk up and be milked. Now, there's all sorts of things about the practicalities of that. I'm not necessarily advocating for full automation, but it's very interesting to see how sometimes the introduction of machines or technology can be more natural than humans doing it. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic into where technology can play a role at different times. Other times you've just got really great examples of what humans have been able to make possible with the type of machines that they do. You talk about sort of the robotics and automation in other sectors. It's quite incredible what's possible through those machines.
And so clearly there are benefits potentially for farmers and growers. There are potential benefits in terms of, animal welfare, and I know from previous work that I've done, there can be around the quality of produce grown and so on, and being able to improve timeliness of harvesting and post-harvest management and so on. All good stuff, as well as potentially some environmental gains. So I'm interested in the drivers that impact on the level of kind of uptake, because clearly, it sounds to me as though there are kind of agri-tech opportunities out there that perhaps aren't as widely adopted as you might expect on the basis of some of the benefits. So I imagine this is something you've given quite a lot of thought to, so I'm interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the use of the word adoption in these type of discussions, because adoption is different than a transaction. It actually implies there's an ongoing relationship, and I think that's very much part of what technology adoption is about. I think it was Andy McFarlane who, when I sort of started out in those True Test days at the very beginning, who sort of educated me in saying, that farming is a game of limiting factors, and so farmers and growers are going to know what's constraining their business at any one time, and they're going to look at tools and solutions that'll address that issue, and they'll effectively form a relationship with the supplier who might be able to help them solve that solution. So adoption is ultimately about a process of behavior change. And so someone's trying to achieve something, and they know that they're going to need to change both their own behavior and the behavior of the system within which they work. And they decide therefore I'm going to look for this tool to enable me to do that. We're sort of lucky in New Zealand. There's been a lot of conversation around how the market conditions we have in New Zealand, the fact that there aren't any direct subsidies, means that growing and farming in New Zealand has always been a very professional activity, and it's always been looked at in terms of, very, very directly how can I be good at what I'm doing within this business. So we actually have quite good levels of adoption of technology in New Zealand because people have looked at it in a very pragmatic way. Sometimes even when the technologies might not necessarily be ready or fit for wider scale usage, we have a very healthy population of what we call trailblazers. So we think it's about 12 to 15% of the market. We did some research on this in 2022, and we're just about to repeat it. That was a baseline piece of work, and we're going to repeat it now to see whether attitudes, behaviours, and actual levels of adoption have changed. But that was apparent in horticulture, in dairy, in arable, and in dry stock, that we have a population who are trailblazers and probably quite attracted to technology, the newness of it and the new capabilities of it. That probably doesn't describe the full population behind those trailblazers, so those groups are not necessarily representative of the wider community. If you're farming and growing, by almost definition, you're going to be extremely pragmatic. You're going to see outcomes, within a season. You're going to have a lot of constraints within your business, so you're very pragmatic in how you apply things. But I think that dynamic still leaves people open to finding new ways of doing things. They've just got a pretty high bar in making sure that it can actually deliver on those things. Again, that's why I love agritech, that it has that type of user who is extremely discerning and holding a relatively high bar for, will this actually deliver value within my property?
So I'm interested to push you a bit harder on this one, in the sense that you have, I know, quite an interesting international perspective as well through the work that you do in AgritechNZ and other work, and particularly in Ireland and Europe you're very well connected. So how do you think New Zealand stacks up in terms of that kind of openness to new technology, adoption of new approaches, compared to some other places on the planet? Because clearly we're not, we're one small nation doing farming in our particular kind of way.
I think New Zealand is doing extremely well within the conditions that make up New Zealand. So productive practice in food is a very big part of what New Zealand does. It's a significant part of the economy. As I say, it's done without direct subsidies, therefore it's very professionalised and very good at what it does. That definitely creates an environment where we've seen many firsts happening in New Zealand, whether that's milk meters, electric fence, a whole pile of firsts that have been developed in New Zealand. Those conditions of farmers and growers being professionally driven or commercially driven is different than other sectors as well. So when you compare it to the European Union, where a lot of farming behaviours are influenced by the Common Agricultural Policy and therefore subsidies and measures that are put in place, that's a different environment and puts a different focus on what you need to be good at. Do you need to be good at managing the requirements around achieving subsidies, or you need to be good at growing and producing? And so the latter has sort of created a very good environment for both technology adoption and technology creation. When you look at the agri-tech innovators out there and you speak to most of them, they'll all be talking about, well, mum and dad were farming in Te Kuiti or were growing in Christchurch or wherever. And so I think a lot of our innovators in New Zealand are probably one or no more than two generations out of a growing system themselves. That's a little bit different in Ireland, but similar. It's very different in many other parts of the world. So that all creates conditions for New Zealand to be standing up really well in terms of, technology development and technology adoption. If there's anything that sort of contains that, then it's probably the scale at which we do things here. So, we are a smaller population, we're not a small nation, but definitely a small population, and therefore our growing systems are probably operate at a different scale than what we see happening internationally, and sometimes scale enables things to be done differently. So there are certain production systems out there for food, particularly in poultry and swine, which are very large industrialized processes, and they don't exist in that scale. I mean, to be honest, I don't believe we have any industrialized farming in New Zealand at all, when you compare what that might mean to systems overseas. So we do really well within the constraints that we've got. The constraints that we've got are very conducive to innovation and technology development, but there's constraints on that as well when you look at what sort of scale can mean in other parts of the world, and overall, production systems.
It sounds to me as though we need to have another conversation when you've done the update to the adoption survey study that you're going to do, and unpack this a bit more in that international comparison. I'd be really interested.
We haven't done direct, so we haven't formally, apart from, we've read reports from the US. We're in discussions. We're doing some knowledge exchange with the UK Agritech Centre at the moment. They're doing some adoption work in the UK. So I'm speaking at one of their events next week, and we'll do some knowledge exchange with them. So we haven't formally done any comparisons, but I'm also keen to sort of expose what's different and therefore what's useful in understanding what the experiences are here in New Zealand.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. So we've talked a lot about different positive aspects of agritech and what that can bring to the food system. And I'm not looking to kind of undermine that at all. But I think it would be good to explore a little bit some of the kind of potentially unintended consequences of it. And I'm thinking particularly in a New Zealand context, because there are all sorts of different kind of global contexts in which food is being produced. So I think we need to kind of focus this down in New Zealand. And I guess one of the issues that you do hear occasionally mentioned is the potential for kind of job losses for, people moving out of farming, being replaced by, various tech interventions. Have you got a view on that, the likelihood or the consequences?
Yeah, I mean, that specific example, there's a lot of choices around how technology is applied and where it's applied that will have people deciding what's the impact they're really looking for. I mean, most of the use of technology in terms of automation and labour is actually addressing an existing issue in terms of we have a labour challenge here. We can't get this job done. We can't be competitive in the way this job is done. Therefore, we're looking for a solution. Also, in a lot of situations, we're not talking about some form of overnight or immediate switch. We're talking about an adjustment to current practices, which often can mean that we're applying human activities and endeavours to something that's more suitable to a better use of human skills rather than a repetitive task or potentially a dangerous task. I'm not sort of saying that all technology is good or denying that technology can do harm. There's no doubt that it can do, but I guess it's the choices around how it's applied at different times. And as you say, it's trying to be conscious of unintended consequences, which is a challenge considering that they're unintended. But I think there's decisions around how that gets applied. Yeah. So I mean, fundamentally to your question, I agree that technology can do harm. We could really make things worse for society, even with good intent, as we've talked about. This idea of technologies that might end up controlling some resource, whether it's water or it's nutrients, and so technology allows better use of that nutrient or resource, and therefore we end up ultimately ending up more of that water or resource because we found a really good way of doing it and translating that into profits through greater growth, and we haven't taken into account that actually there's been a whole pile of other consequences that have happened at the same time. There's a reality to that, I don't think technology creates any of that, but the decisions made about where and how to apply technology come with responsibilities.
Yeah, thank you. And that kind of makes sense to me. I think part of what you were alluding to there is a phenomenon called Jevons paradox, where you introduce a technical innovation and efficiency gain in the use of some resource, water being a good one, but rather than that delivering perhaps an expected benefit for the environment, it just enables more intensive production. So you do get a gain in terms of that productivity, but perhaps not the environmental outcome you were expecting. But one of the particular dimensions of technology in farming that I'm interested in is whether you think over time it will result in a net increase or decrease in the consumption of energy in the food production system, because energy seems to me likely to become a crunch point with climate change, biodiversity loss, and simply being able to access the fossil fuel resources we become used to. So it's a big question, but just your kind of gut feeling?
I really don't know. We talked about sort of, machines and mechanical advantage and how it enables you to do more. So therefore, yes, you can apply more energy and get more outcomes, or you can apply less energy and get less outcomes. So it's ultimately trying to look at the balance between those things. There's no doubt that, the increasing digitization of everything we do on the planet is needing new resources in the form of data centers and for cloud computing, which is just being transformational to humankind. And that is a new capability that's requiring significant new energy sources to fuel, which is why we have this growing focus on, green data centers and what's possible there. So I think, yes, there's going to be new, technologies require new forms of energy or a new way of using energy at different times, and they create certain outcomes. I think all of these conversations ultimately come down to trying to take that overall view of, well, what is the system we're putting in place here? How do we holistically look at it? So if we are purely looking at productivity and growth mindsets, we have the opportunity to do a lot of harm. And we have been doing that for generations, which is the purpose of your investigations and these discussions, that we know that our behaviors have sort of exceeded planetary boundaries, and that's visible and obvious, and we're trying to come to terms with that and the change that's required. I don't think technology has created that situation, but we've used technology to exacerbate that situation. Now we need to look at trying to take a more holistic view, and technology can equally be used to create more visibility around some of those consequences, by measuring and monitoring. And, so our energy usage, well, if we use more energy and get less outcomes, or use more energy and don't get the outcomes that we desired, well, shame on us. It's not like we don't know what the energy usage is. It's not like we can't measure it and we can't expose it and we can't relate it to this behavior caused that outcome. Those are actually really simple things to sort of measure and expose, and I think we're beginning to quantify them in new ways now. We're seeing our value chains adapt as they should in terms of proper carbon accounting and proper emissions accounting and proper energy accounting. And so all of a sudden it is, again, it's technologies and reporting systems that are allowing us to sort of account for those things and bring them together. So I don't think technology is the cause of the problem, but it can be used to create the problem.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned a moment ago about the increase in use of data and data processing and the infrastructure that we need for that, which kind of feels like a segue to what everybody is talking about at the moment, generative AI, artificial intelligence, and your thoughts on the role that could play in the agritech sphere over the coming years.
Well, it's interesting to see it's being applied, really actively in really interesting ways. I was at a Fonterra conference last week and just looking at, some of the data entry challenges or these sort of administrative challenges that some farmers, just really don't enjoy doing. And Fonterra just looking at some AI-based tools to do some automated capture of inputs into their systems at a farming level, and some really cool tools that are sort of, making life easier for farmers in that space. People obviously talk about AI as having, it will have more impact on humanity than electricity has. And I think there's an inevitability to that. There's truth. So that's both massively exciting and fundamentally scary as well, and trying to figure out what's the pathway through that. Again, I know we've had comments about technology optimism, and so we can have that discussion. And I am an optimist when I see the power for AI will be largely determined for, in which directions do we train it, and which direction, what's the quality of questions that we're asking generative AI to feed back to us and to build on. I'm fascinated by the idea when it comes to trying to create more visibility around these other consequences, these things beyond just productivity gains and growth. That can we be training AI to be creating more visibility around some of those consequences that happen as well. So, in addition to monitoring what's having with productivity, monitoring the consequences, doing the pattern matching between that, and for us to be even more conscious of what are these externalities? What are the impacts we're having? So I do see great potential for AI. It's being used actively everywhere, of course, and I think again it can be applied for good.
So you mentioned technological optimism, and I did want to just pick up on that as we kind of round out this part of the discussion. So, technological optimism in itself isn't a bad thing, but if it leads to deferring painful behavior change or the introduction of, potentially unpopular regulation for the greater good, it can be problematic. I don't sense from the conversations we've had over many years, you kind of take that approach to technological optimism, and there are things absolutely that we can be hopeful and optimistic about here. But do you think there is a risk that we promise solutions to some of these really big problems, climate change, biodiversity loss and so on, through technology, when fundamentally we need to kind of reset our relationship with the environment to really fix things?
Yes, there's definitely risks in that space. So first of all, I'd say obviously technology is never optimistic. It's humans that are optimistic, and so it's a human dynamic that we're talking about in terms of where do we try and find solutions. I think humans are capable of being incredibly creative and achieving things, that to many people seem impossible or magic, and all of a sudden, it becomes available, and it, in some cases, becomes widely available. So I think there are things that are worth being aspirational about. There are moonshots that we should be taking when it comes to what solutions technology can deliver, and yet it would be foolish to bet the entire household on just those things. So you want all of that to happen. You want the aspiration and you want the optimism. But with the level of crisis that we've got now, we have to look at what are the decisions that we make today and in the very immediate future to start adjusting behaviours and using technologies to help us do that. And so I guess my answer would be something along the lines of chewing and walking, walking and chewing at the same time, in terms of there's a crisis in place. Therefore, we need immediate change and we can't wait for technologies. That doesn't mean that we don't continue investing and trying to develop those technologies. So it's finding a balance in there somewhere, which is a complex answer and it's contradictory. And hey, that's life.
Yeah, but the food system is a complex, contradictory system. And it's really refreshing to have this kind of conversation where we can acknowledge some of these potential downsides, but also celebrate some of the potential upsides. And it's good from my point of view to know somebody in a position of leadership such as you has got that really kind of balanced, pragmatic kind of view.
And fundamentally, it comes down to human decisions. Again, it's just, what are the things we choose to do now with what we know now to the best of our knowledge now, while still being aspirational and striving for new capabilities.
And so I do want to change tack now and talk a little bit more about you. And I know you're personally, and listeners will have picked this up from the conversation, personally invested in creating a sustainable food system for your kids and future generations. What are you doing kind of in your own life to express that beyond your professional activity?
Well, my life is blessed in terms of the people I'm surrounded by. So, Miranda and myself came together because we both sort of, I guess, live very consciously and very aware of the life we want to live, the life we want for our kids, and what that means for our wider community. So, Miranda's work is definitely actively working in areas of improving environmental outcomes and using human dynamics and human relationships to improve those outcomes. What that comes back to at home for us, if you were to open our cupboard or open our fridge, you would see very little packaging in there. We're actively avoiding, sort of easily packaged and consumer goods. We're a household of ingredients rather than, prepackaged food. We do eat meat, but we're eating a lot less meat and very much choosing where our meat comes from. So we'll know we sort of eat less but better quality. I think the Michael Pollan's work around, sort of eat food, as in stuff you can recognize as food, mostly plants, emphasis on the word mostly and not too much. That sort of summarizes the sort of food choices and stuff that we live. Actually, at exactly the same time I started working in the agritech space, we moved on to a livestock block out in West Auckland. Very interestingly, when I used to work with Navman in the marine electronics space, I had a sea kayak which had more electronics on it than your average launch. And then as soon as I started working in the agritech space and got a livestock block, I have more electric fencing. All of my animals are individually identified. They're regularly weighed. There's lots of different systems in place there. So my agritech experience comes to life on the property. But also we had a permaculture plan done for the property 17 years ago. It's the main map that's up on my workshop at home, and it's a constant reminder of how do we improve the property. So we've done lots of things in terms of refencing and planting. We're far from self-sustaining, but we're more self-sustaining than we were 5 years ago. And so we make a lot of choices in that type of space and sort of bring it to life for both of us. And yeah, I've got kids who are doing work that sort of has built on what they've learned from Miranda and myself, and I see them doing positive steps as well.
That's great. I'd really like to come and, if I may, visit sometime and see what you're doing.
You know the invite is there. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brendan. So in terms of listeners, can you think of one intervention that somebody can make in their own life if they wanted to make a difference in terms of sustainability?
You know, we talk about unintended consequences. It's standing back and just thinking about the consequences of what we're doing, trying to take a more holistic approach and looking at some of the knowledge bases and the thought leaders that can help us do that. I believe we're blessed in New Zealand in terms of the origin story that has made up New Zealand with our Te Tiriti relationship and that Te Ao Maori perspective that is naturally holistic and intergenerational. So many other parts of the world, Ireland included and others, have sort of struggled to maintain connection with some of that wisdom. And I think it's alive and growing and kicking here in New Zealand. So I think, just looking at ways of being more holistic in our decisions and thinking intergenerationally and forcing all of our decisions to do that is a mantra we can bring to every day.
Yeah, that sounds very sensible advice, not necessarily easily done, but something to aspire to. So my last question for you, Brendan, is it sounds trivial, but there have been some fascinating answers to this question from previous people that I've had the pleasure of hosting on this podcast. So no pressure at all, of course. If you had a superpower to try and help make the food system in Aotearoa or globally more sustainable, what would that be?
The future foresight on consequences. I'd like, just to be able to, I mean, when we're talking about things that are as complex as food systems, the reality is that it's very difficult to connect cause and effect. You can't say, if I do this, this will happen. And so if I had a superpower, it would be in complex systems to be able to see those consequences more quickly in advance. So I'd love to have that superpower. Maybe technologies can help us get a little bit closer to that, and maybe AI can help us get a little bit closer to that. In the meanwhile, let's just look at taking smaller steps and sensing what happens before we start making big commitments and going into spaces we don't know.
Thanks, Brendan. It's another great answer. Really appreciate that. And it's been a really delightful, interesting conversation with so many threads that would be great to pick up at some point in the future. So perhaps you'd be willing to be a guest on this podcast series again at some point.
I would love to come back.
Thank you very much. So have you given me cause for hope? You certainly have. As I mentioned earlier, the leadership that you're bringing in this space makes me hopeful. And you've painted a picture of some of the really positive outcomes that we can hope for from sensible application of technology in the food system. So thank you for that. Have you provided a call to action for us all listening to the podcast? Yes, it's that taking the big picture view of the decisions we make in our day-to-day lives and trying to understand what some of the consequences of that would be. So thank you for that as well. So it's a bit of a result all round. And for the listeners, thank you so much for listening to this episode of my podcast series. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you're interested in more conversations about people, planet and food, please subscribe to Sigest and rate and review the show. And of course, please share this with others who you think might be interested. And finally, if you've got any questions or suggestions, or even people that you think I might like to speak to on this podcast series, please contact me on sigest@plantandfood.co.nz. Next up, I'm going to be speaking to Kate Mayer, who is the founder and chief executive of an organisation called the Planetary Accounting Network, and they're doing some fascinating work translating the planetary boundaries concepts into actionable things that businesses can do to make a difference and describe that to consumers. So really looking forward to that interview in a wee while. Until then, mā te wā, thank you for listening.